Aspire is a great tool for local development. Think of it as a vast improvement on the IDE debugging experience we currently have. And if you're starting a new project, I would highly recommend that you add Aspire to it. But most projects were created before Aspire. So how do you add Aspire to an existing project? That's what we're going to show you in this video. We will also add an additional project after Aspire is wired up to see how to do that as well. Now, if you don't know me, my name is Tim Corey, and it's my goal to make becoming a software developer easier. I offer dozens of paid training courses to ensure you stay up to date in software development, regardless of where you are currently in your career. For more information, including to get a free course, go to imtimcorey.com. So let's start off with a brand new project, but we're going to treat it like it's a legacy project. So we'll create a new project, and let's do a Blazor web app. Let's call this existing app and then existing app demo. So this will be our existing application. We are not going to include Aspire orchestration. We are going to do auto, which is server and WebAssembly projects, and yes to HTTPS. So this is going to be working as if it doesn't know about Aspire, because it doesn't yet. There's nothing in here for Aspire. There's no orchestration currently. If we run this application, it's going to run like any normal Blazor web app would. Now, we could make this more complicated, and we're going to in a little bit when we add in an API to give us a different weather forecast. Because I don't love this whole, -6 degrees Celsius is sweltering. That doesn't seem right. So we'll go ahead and fix that after we add Aspire. But for now, this is what our web app looks like currently. So this is our legacy stand-in application as if this is a real application. Okay, so what do you do now that you have this application to get Aspire working? Well, let's right-click on a solution. We're going to add two different projects one at a time. So the first project, if you choose here Aspire, you'll see Aspire Starter App, and that can be really useful if you create a brand new project and say Aspire Starter App. That will give you a good template to look at to say, oh, this is what is done here, and this is how you do that there, and kind of get to see what the maybe ideal scenario is, or the general starting point best practices are. So with that, we're going to add two projects, though, of our own to the existing project. One is app host, and the other is service defaults. So we'll talk about both of these. I have covered these before in my intro to Aspire, but we can talk about them as we go. So let's just call this app host, and we'll add it for .NET 10. Aspire version, I have 13.0. I believe 13.1 is out now. I need to upgrade to that, but for now, this works just fine. And hit create. Okay, so the next thing we'll do is we will change so that the app host is the startup project. So this right now, the app host.cs has basically nothing in it. It just has the, yes, get things started and build, but it doesn't know about any of the project, doesn't know how it works, not a problem. But this is the starting point. This is what Aspire will launch instead of trying to launch your existing app or 3 or 4 applications. We're going to just launch app host, and that will then allow us to launch the other projects from there. So we'll leave this blank for now. We're going to add one more, but this is the heart of Aspire right here, is the app host. But let's add one more, and this is a helper project. So the service defaults, this gives us, and let's just call it service defaults. So we'll keep it clear. I will give you a source code. There's a link down in the description. You can go ahead and download the source code if you want to see what's going on. But in the service defaults, this is not a project we launch. Think of this like a repository for a couple of ways to upgrade our existing projects with better features. You don't have to add this. But the big deal here is, and let's collapse these down so you see just the signatures. I could have said collapse the signatures, that's okay. So we have this add service defaults. So what this is going to do, if we actually open this up and look, it's going to configure OpenTelemetry. It's going to add the default health checks. It's going to add service discovery. And I think that's about it. Configure HTTP client defaults. So that's what that does, which actually calls these three methods right here. They configure OpenTelemetry, add OpenTelemetry exporters, and add default health checks. And you can read more about what they do, but essentially it's the kind of the bare minimum for OpenTelemetry and health checks, adding those into your existing projects. The idea is Aspire works best when it has more information. It has OpenTelemetry information. It has health checks. It has logging and other things. It can bring all those together to give you a better picture of how your application is working. But not all our projects have OpenTelemetry or health checks or other things. And so instead of saying, well, you got Aspire, but it doesn't really do much because you don't have much, they said, hey, what if we create a way to get you started in all of those things? And then if your projects already have OpenTelemetry, well, then you don't need to add this project. They already have health checks. You don't need to add health checks. You can customize this the way you want, but by default, if you have none of those things, this gets you up and going. And then finally down here, map default endpoints. And this is saying, hey, if you're in development, then add the health checks and map those health checks so that you can check on those with Aspire. Now, this is only for in development. I talked earlier about the fact that Aspire is like an upgrade to your IDE's debugging process. Too many people think of Aspire as a tool for production or deploying it. Or yes, Aspire can deploy your applications. It's getting better at that. But it really is, at its heart, at its core, it's a tool for working with your applications, whether they are very, very simple or very, very complex microservice interaction systems. It is designed to help you work with those things locally, because the local development story was very, very weak. We had to figure out, well, if I launch this Docker container and this other Docker container, and then if I do launch my applications with these three projects running, then and I order it right, then I can develop locally. And that's clunky. With Aspire, we can do all those things in this application and then check this into our source control so that any developer who jumps on our team can just run this application locally, and it will spawn up all the things it needs to in the right order with all the right settings. So this is for local development. So that's why they're saying, hey, this is for in development. And there are some security implications with health checks and other things if they're running when not in development. And so they, by default, make you secure by saying it's only for development mode. When you publish this, those health checks turn off unless you explicitly say, no, I want them. So that's the extensions for in service default. That's really all service default does, is it gives you these things to get you up and running yourself more quickly with health checks, OpenTelemetry, and more. You don't have to add this. You could modify this if you want and say, hey, I only want parts of these things, but this by default allows you to take full advantage of Aspire. So let's go through and see what we have to do, because we've got Aspire here, but there's nothing to it right now. There's nothing that's going to run. It's just going to be a blank dashboard. So let's go into our existing apps program.cs. So this is the program.cs for our Blazor web app, which is this is the server side part of that. There's also the client side part of that, which we don't have to touch. But let's go to the existing project. Actually, right click on dependencies first and say manage projects and check the box for service defaults. We do want to bring those in. And where we do that, well, what we're going to do is we're going to say right up here after builder, we'll say builder.add service defaults. And if that sounds familiar, it's because in our extension methods, we have an add service defaults right here. That's what we're doing. We're calling that extension method right at the top that adds that to our dependency injection So we have the service defaults that we need. And then we're also going to come down here at the bottom, right before our app.run. We're going to say app.map default endpoints. And that's going to add our health checks. So, or the pathing for our health checks. So we've now wired up our existing project to have the extra telemetry we need in Aspire or want in Aspire. It's going to provide us the other things we're looking for in Aspire. Okay, that's it for our existing projects. Now we don't have to touch the existing app.client because that's actually part of existing app. That's how Blazor web apps work. If it was a WebAssembly project, then we wouldn't do everything. We would do some things. We would put it in app host. We wouldn't add the map default endpoints, probably. Okay, so in app host, we're going to right-click on dependencies, add project reference. We're going to add our reference to our existing app, really to all of our projects. So it wouldn't hurt to add to the client, but we're just going to say existing app. And then we're going to go into our app host file itself. And in here, what we're going to do is, I like to name all of them. You don't have to name any that you're not going to depend on other services. I'll explain that in a minute. But I'm going to say var Blazor web equals builder.add project. And the project is projects dot, and it's going to list your existing projects. So we're going to add the existing app, which is our Blazor web app. And we're going to call this Blazor web. Okay, so what have we done here? We're adding our existing app, which is our Blazor web app, to Aspire and saying, hey, you're going to look for this project, and we're going to name it Blazor web. You can name it whatever you want. I typically give the name here the same as my variable name. So that way it's just simpler for me in my brain. But what this variable is going to be is a reference to that project. That way, if we have a different project that depends on this project, we can say Blazor web. And it would know Blazor web is this right here. Okay, now we're not done here. That's why we have the red squiggly. On a new line, we're going to say dot with external HTTP endpoints with HTTP health checks. And we're going to say @/health. And that's it for now. Okay, so what that's going to do is register the Blazor web app with Aspire. So with that, let's go ahead and run this project. So all I did is I registered an existing project and I made sure it had those health checks and other things. Let's wait for it to launch. It's going to take a minute to get set up. But now we do, it's launching the Blazor app. So there we go. And for whatever reason, it opened up the dashboard on a different screen. So there we go. There's our dashboard now. It says Blazor web running. The start time, the source is our CS proj. There's our URL to go to it. And we can see things like the console log. There's a console log for the Blazor web app. You want to see the structured logging for what's going on. There you go. There's all the structured logging. You can dive into more information about any of these logs, where they are, their IDs, etc. You can get trace information if you want trace information about what calls are being made. If we go over here, and I'll navigate to different pages off the screen. There you go. You can see I just navigated to another page. So now there's a lot more information here about what's happening and when it's happening and etc. So right down here, you can see all the stuff it's gathering because of this. Loading additional pages. There's a loading the weather page you can see. And if we look, we can see there's the timing for it and what actually happened and when, etc. There's no complicated calls here, right? The weather page is just simulating an API, which we're going to fix. But for now, it tells us duration is 0.51 seconds, and probably that would go down if we continue to ask for it. So with that, we have metrics as well. If you want to, log into or find the different metrics for this, what circuits are open, etc. So that is all we had to do to wire up our Aspire to our existing application. So the key steps are to add the two projects, the service defaults and the app host. And then in your existing program.cs for any of your existing apps, we added the app.map default endpoints, as well as the add service defaults up near the top. Those two things, as well as making sure we had a reference to that service defaults project. And then app host, we just wire up, hey, here's our existing app and here's where it's at, and go ahead and launch this. Now, this is intentionally a pretty simple project. But what if we had either an additional project, or what is going to happen as well is we have Aspire wired up, we're all good, and they go, hey, we want to add another project. Well, what do we do? That's another kind of part of this whole, how do you work with Aspire? So let's do that. Let's add a API. So new project, a ASP.core web API, and we'll call this our sample API. And HTTPS, I'm not going to enlist Aspire orchestration. We could do that. It would connect it to Aspire. We're not going to do that. We're going to do it manually. And we are going to use top-level statements. Add OpenAPI support is fine. So we're good. And we're not going to use controllers. So we're going to use a minimal API approach. Okay, so let's find our API here, our sample API. And we can get rid of the HTTP file. We're not going to worry about that. And I don't like this weather, right? I don't like how the weather works. I think it's clunky. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to bring in a new weather forecast. So instead of typing it out and making you painfully watch me type it, I'm going to paste it in. It's essentially the same thing. But now what I did was I actually put in real summaries. So the real summaries are stay inside, bundle up, wear a sweatshirt, enjoy a day, and crank the AC, depending on what the temperature is in Celsius. And so we have the date time for the next 5 days, the random temperature in Celsius, it's a random, and then based upon that random temperature, a summary that actually makes sense for that random temperature, which means I can get rid of this array of nonsense. So we now have a weather forecast. It's a bit different, right? It's different than just a standard weather forecast. What we're going to do is we're going to wire this up to our existing project. So you come in here to program.cs, and we're going to say, hey, we want to access that API. How do we do that? Well, we're going to add a service that is an HTTP client. So builder.services.add HTTP client. I'm going to call this client API. And we'll say client and the arrow. And we're going to put some curly braces here. And I'll say client.base address equals, for now, I'm going to leave it blank. But we're going to talk about that in a minute. So this is one of the things that Aspire does well, is that what is this URL, right? And normally what we do is we'd say, new, and then we'd say, an actual address like, I don't know, HTTPS, localhost 7812, or whatever the actual URL is for our API. But that's going to change, right? It's going to change based upon, is that the same URL that somebody else has? Is it, how do you know what that URL is? And, we can do it manually. We can go into properties, launch settings.json. We can look, and it is 7037. So we could put 7037 there, but Aspire has a better way of doing that. And we're going to use that. But the Aspire documentation typically will say something like this, where it says API or something similar. We're not going to do that because this is still hard coding. And I don't like to hard code things. So instead of doing that, what we're going to do is we're going to actually access the configuration. So get rid of that. And we're going to do it right. Builder.configuration, and we'll ask for the API endpoint. And we will say, or empty string if there is no configuration at that point. We could throw an exception if you wanted to, if we didn't have an endpoint. That might be, good as well. And you know what? Throw a new exception. We're just going to throw a base exception. There we go. So let's unpin it so you can see it. Okay. So what this does is it looks up the API endpoint in our configuration. If it doesn't find it, it's going to throw an exception. That way we know, hey, you're missing the API's URL. But we're going to put the API URL in. So app settings, we're going to look for the API endpoint. So like so. And by default, we'll say HTTPS API. Now, that's not localhost :7037. It's not, it's not specific. In fact, that's okay, because what we're going to do is let Aspire figure out where that is based upon it being wired up. So that's the default. And the reason I'm putting it here is because when you deploy to production, this is going to get replaced with the actual API for your actual production API. And if you're in, let's say your staging environment, it's going to be a staging API. So people get confused at the idea that Aspire somehow has to be in production because you're hard coding a URL here, right? Well, no, you're just putting a string here that Aspire can figure out what the URL is and replace it locally. But when you go to production, you do that during your CI/CD process. You replace that with the actual production URL. So this is something that is only for local development. Okay, so we now have the API endpoint. We're going to save that. But now what we need to do is we need to wire up our, let's wire up the actual app host. So let's go over to app host. It doesn't know about the project yet. Oh, one more thing before I forget. Sample API. We need to right-click on dependencies, add a project reference, go to our service defaults, say OK. And then in our program.cs, we're going to come up here and say, add OpenAPI, say builder.services.add service defaults. Okay, which that's having a problem with. And that's because it's not builder.services, it's just builder.addServiceDefaults. There we go. And then down here, before app.run, we're going to say app.map default endpoints, like so. And that wires up our API now to work with Aspire. I'm sorry, it wires up our API to work with the service defaults, which make it easier to work with Aspire. Now we go to the other end of things. We go to our app host project, go to dependencies, say add project reference to our API. And now app host knows about our API. So now we can actually do the wiring up. I'm going to do it before Blazor Web because there is an order to this. Blazor Web is going to depend on the API. So I'm going to say var API equals builder.add project. Or I say projects dot sample API. And then we're going to call it API. Notice the naming there. By the way, if you remember in our app settings.json, I said just API. Well, that's what it's going to look for is that name, which we also named it here in this variable. Both are important. Okay. And we're going to say dot with HTTP health checks at /health. And that's it. So we've done all we need to in this one line for our API, but I want to now modify my Blazor web app to say, hey, don't start until the API is ready. And also, it has a reference to that API. So I'm going to say with reference to API. That's the variable. So it references that variable and goes, oh, okay, I know what that whole thing is. And then we're also going to say wait for API. So what it's going to do is start both projects, but it knows that the Blazor web app depends on the API because we said wait for the API and reference the API. So because it references the API and there's an order to it, when we're saying wait for, it's going to start the API. It's going to wait until the health checks go, yes, the API is healthy. Once that happens, then it's going to start the Blazor web project. So now we have an order to our process. We hit save. We used to do this, by the way, if you right-click on solution, you can say this configure startup projects. We'd say, okay, we have multiple startup projects. We're going to come down here and wow, I can't make this bigger, can we? There we go. We'd say, well, I want the existing app, and we say start, and they'd move up the API like so. Really clunky UI, but move the API up and then start that first. And that's how we used to do things. But that's a per machine, per user configuration. This gets put in a source control so that you can have your next door neighbor, when they download the project, they can have this startup process the same way you do. It makes getting started with development so much easier. Okay, so now the last thing I have to do is I've wired up our API in Aspire. And I've added service defaults and all the rest. The only thing I haven't really done, which is something I should probably do, and that is in the actual weather project. So components, pages, under, is it page in? Oh, pages, there we go. Weather. I need to actually add it here. They haven't actually used the API. So let's do this real quick. Inject HTTP client factory. And we'll call this underscore HTTP client factory. So now we have that injected. And then what we'll do is down here where they're doing all this stuff, we're going to get rid of a bunch of these things here. Let's get rid of, well, all of this. We're not going to do the task.delay either. That's to simulate waiting for our API. We're not going to do that. Var HTTP client equals HTTP client factory dot get client. I'm sorry, create client. There we go. And API. And that API is the name we gave it when we were in program.cs named that HTTP client. So it's a named HTTP client. So we're asking for it now. And so now we have that created, we can say forecasts equals await HTTP client dot get from JSON async. And we'll say weather forecast array. And then ask for weather, which is the endpoint we're looking for. Okay, so that's all we have to do to now call our API. Let's launch this and watch what happens when we see our Aspire dashboard. Hopefully it'll start somewhere near the screen. And it didn't. There we go. So now they're both running. And now if we launch our Blazor site and go to weather, it says crank the AC, enjoy the day, crank the AC, bundle up, because based upon actual temperatures being kind of, important. So 129 degrees Fahrenheit or 54 degrees Celsius, crank that AC, right? Versus bundle up if it's 37 degrees Fahrenheit or 3 Celsius. So now we actually have more information. If you come here to traces, you'll see that we call the weather. Notice it's calling both projects. We can see that. And we can see what's going on with these two, how much time each took, and what went on during that call. We can also open up more information about the telemetry and so on. So that's how we wire up an existing project and how we add to an existing project. So we had an existing project of our Blazor web app. We then add Aspire to it. And then we add yet another project to our overall solution and added that to Aspire as well. So it's really not hard to add Aspire to an existing project. There can be a lot more complicated configurations. Obviously, you can have Aspire do things like start up Docker containers and wire up dependencies in other ways besides just projects. But by doing this, all you have to really do is add app host, says a startup project, and then you have, if you want those service defaults and want those additional things, add that service defaults project. If you already have telemetry and health checks and the rest, leave it off. But then you're pretty much done. It's really app host, this little bit of configuration. Actually, this configuration right here is all you have to do to get your existing project up and running. Couple things to point out. First of all, if you want the source code, that's linked down in the description. Also, I've been saying Aspire this entire time, but I want to point out that it used to be called .NET Aspire, and some people still call it .NET Aspire, but it's not .NET Aspire. It's Aspire. And the reason why is because of the fact that Aspire is more than just .NET. It was built with .NET. It runs great with .NET. It's awesome for .NET projects, but you can still use it with JavaScript projects or other projects of other types. So just know you're not limited to .NET. It can do so much more, but this is how you put it into an existing .NET project. Thanks for watching, and as always, I am Tim Corey.